Hi there. In last week's discussion, I talked about inflation. I also mentioned how the efforts to fight inflation could precipitate a recession. After the episode, an associate commented that he had heard somewhere something about stagflation and didn't fully understand it. He suggested that perhaps I should talk about it because there may be many people like him who could benefit from the discussion. So today's discussion, therefore, is about stagflation. Before I continue, however, do visit our website where I curate news and publications from international financial organizations and world central banks. Topics cover a wide range of financial and economic issues that affect individual countries or the world economy. For instance, COVID-19, inflation, or the war in Ukraine. Please also subscribe to this channel and be informed whenever we publish a new video. So, what is stagflation? In the discussion about inflation, I mentioned that central bank policies designed to fight inflation led to a reduction in economic activity. On the other hand, policies designed to stimulate economic activity are likely to result in inflation as the economy heats up. This relationship is traditionally depicted on the Phillips curve, which is the primary framework used by central banks. The Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis, in a paper titled, "What is the Phillips curve and why has it flattened?" put it this way, and I quote, "Understanding whether a relationship exists between these two variables, unemployment and inflation, is important when it comes to monetary policy making. Why is that? The Federal Reserve has a dual mandate to promote maximum sustainable employment and price stability. Historically, there has often been some trade-off between inflation and unemployment. This trade-off is the so-called Phillips curve relationship. The Phillips curve is named after economist A.W. Phillips, who examined UK unemployment and wages from 1861 to 1957. Phillips found an inverse relationship between the level of unemployment and the rate of change in wages, that is, wage inflation. Since his famous 1958 paper, the relationship has more generally been extended to price inflation. Starting in 2012, while the unemployment rate has declined to levels not seen in 50 years, inflation has remained low, even below the Fed's 2% target for most of the period shown in the graph. This suggests that the Phillips curve has flattened, or that the relationship might not be as strong as it once was." End quote. So basically, to recap, central bankers are always faced with a trade-off between inflation and unemployment. When inflation is rising, that is clearly the enemy to fight, but fighting it raises the specter of unemployment. When unemployment is rising, policies should then stimulate the economy so that more people may be employed. There are cases, however, where shocks to the economy break this straightforward relationship between inflation and unemployment, or recession, or economic downturn. Such a situation was experienced in the late 1970s and early 1980s in the major industrial economies, where you simultaneously had high inflation and high unemployment. This is known as stagflation, a combination of stagnation and inflation. According to Wikipedia, and I quote, "The term, a portmanteau of stagnation and inflation, is generally attributed to Ian MacLeod, a British Conservative Party politician who became Chancellor of the Exchequer in 1970. MacLeod used the term in a 1965 speech to Parliament during a period of simultaneously high inflation and unemployment in the United Kingdom. Warning the House of Commons of the gravity of the situation, he said, "We now have the worst of both worlds, not just inflation on the one side or stagnation on the other, but both of them together. We have a sort of stagflation situation, and history in modern terms is indeed being made." John Maynard Keynes did not use the term, but some of his work refers to the conditions that most would recognize as stagflation. End quote. In their excellent book, Modern Macroeconomics, Snowden and Vane put it this way, and I quote, "Whatever the causes, this golden age came to an end after 1973, and the economic problems of the 1970s brought the Keynesian bandwagon to an abrupt but temporary halt. The acceleration of inflation, rising unemployment, and a slowdown in economic growth during the 1970s were attributed by Keynesian critics to the misguided expansionary policies carried out in the name of Keynes. Taking the 1960 to 2002 period as a whole, on average in the golden age, both unemployment and inflation were low. But only in the period 1973 to 1983 do we see the simultaneous combination of high unemployment and high inflation, that is, stagflation. To the critics of Keynesianism, stagflation was an inevitable legacy of the golden age of demand management. End quote. Although there is no consensus on the causes of stagflation, it is generally understood that under such conditions, the central bank's traditional tools fail, and the task of fighting on two fronts becomes complicated and hard. Some commentators have been raising the specter of stagflation in relation to the current inflation and central bankers' fight to tame it. This fear is overblown for two reasons. One, unlike the central banks in the 1970s, 1980s, most central banks today are independent. This means they can fight inflation, even if it leads to a recession, which may ultimately be the only way to cool the economy. Two, more fundamentally, however, fighting inflation is more about fighting inflation expectations than fighting current inflation. Expectations affect two critical issues. A, wage demands and wage contracts. If workers and their representatives expect future inflation to be high and remain high for a sustained period, then that would be reflected in higher wage demands. The same goes for firms' pricing decisions, partly to offset wage increases and partly to offset expected rises in other inputs. B, and this is the critical thing, if a central bank has credibility in the eyes of economic agents, then its actions and pronouncements are believable, leading to expectations not becoming anchored in a belief of high inflation. This is what central bank independence does. It confers credibility on the central bank because economic agents and the rest of society know that the central bank will not be swayed by politics or other sentiments in the conduct of monetary policy, in this case to tame inflation. My conclusion, therefore, is that while the world economy may be likely to have a hard landing in the next year or two because monetary policy operates with a lag, stagflation is unlikely to arise.